Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you for not being totally bored by me. Today we're going to be looking at the legend of Beowulf, a really important surviving work of medieval literature, an epic poem and a really useful source showing us the morals that were important to the Anglo Saxons. So before we start, I guess it's worth saying that an epic poem is a long narrative poem, usually about heroic deeds and events that are significant to the culture and society of the poet writing it. And a lot of ancient writers used epic poetry to tell tales of intense adventure and heroic feats. And epic poems were really common in the ancient world because they were ideal for expressing stories orally. And expressing stories orally means that they were told and spread from person to person. So by mouth, they would say the story, the person would remember the story and go and tell it to someone else. And other examples of epic poetry include Gilgamesh and the Iliad, which you might have heard of as well. Now with Beowulf, honestly, we're lucky to even know the story of Beowulf because, like other epic poems, it comes from that oral storytelling tradition. It was originally told by bards who were wandering poets and storytellers, and yes, that's just like the really annoying guy in The Witcher, and they became a folk tale that was passed from generation to generation by word of mouth. And we think the story of Beowulf originates from 600 to 800 BC because the poem does reference some historically real people and places, like King Hrothgar and his mead hall Heorot. But historians don't really agree on a firm date on which it was definitely written. So the only remaining manuscript of Beowulf, which is dated to about the 10th century, is now in the British Library, where you can go and see it because it is usually on display. And we know that this particular version won't be entirely the same as the one told by the bards. And the reason for that is because it features frequent references to the Christian God. And the Anglo Saxons who told this story would have been pagan. That means that they were a pre-Christian society. And despite the remaining manuscript not quite telling us what the oral tales would have, it's pretty common for this to happen. For instance, most fairy tales that we know today, they stem from the days of being told orally to friends and family by the fire, not written down, and then told from generation to generation. But most of them did adapt over time. For instance, in various early tellings of Red Riding Hood, a story which I'm sure we all know, she eats her grandma, she gets away from the wolf by telling him that she needs to caca, which means to poo, and a lot of them include a little bit of sexual implication. Now I know that that's really different to the versions of tales that we know today, but the tales we know today, fairy tales that is, were written down and cemented by people like the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. And then a little bit later, they would have been cleaned up by brands like Disney. And that's what happens with oral tales once they get written down. They usually follow the culture of the person who has written them, who has adapted it to their culture, and then that is accepted as the proper version, when in actual fact there are many acceptable versions of that story. Anyway, bringing it back to Beowulf, the manuscript that we have, however imperfect it is, it had to survive the Middle Ages, it had to survive Henry VIII's Reformation, and it also survived a fire in the 18th century, which it luckily escaped intact, but with a little bit of fire damage. And in addition to that, before the 19th century, Beowulf was kind of written off by academics as a children's story, not important, not worthy of academic research. And so Beowulf perhaps did not get the attention that it really deserved. But luckily, in the 19th century, following the fire that nearly destroyed it, there's quite a bit of interest that springs up. And in the 20th century, there were 3 translations made of Beowulf. Excuse me. Oh yeah, just so you know, it's translated because Beowulf is written in Old English. I'll add a link to some examples of Old English because I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying it. So anyway, the version that I have read is by J.R.R. Tolkien, who admitted to being hugely influenced by this story. And I think Beowulf has really clearly played a huge part in the development of the modern fantasy genre. So, for instance, Lord of the Rings being the obvious one, all the way up to Game of Thrones and even video games like The Witcher, which is now obviously a Netflix show. So, Beowulf is an Anglo Saxon story. And although it's set in Northern or Norse Europe, many Scandinavian cultures have adopted it as a story of their own, which is fair enough. I mean, the story is set there in some historically real places. So, because this is going to be quite a long series, I'm going to split this into 2 videos. You will see why. We will look at part 1 of Beowulf in the next video, and I will make 2 more parts in addition to that. Okay, stay cute, be kind, and please subscribe.